Hello, and welcome to the Labor Jawn podcast, where we exhibit the working class history of Philadelphia and the surrounding world. My name is Sam James. I'm the co-curator, and my co-co-curator is...
I'm Gabe Christie, and we're joined today by a number of guests who all collaborated on the Museum Unions Enact Workplace Justice Zine.
My name's Amanda Tobin Ripley. I am an independent scholar and practitioner. I used to work full-time in museums, and now I research museum labor.
Hi, so my name is Adam Rizzo. I am a museum educator, have been for about 12, maybe longer, 13 years now, formerly of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I was the president of Local 397, which is a part of AFSCME, and am now at the Penn Museum, still working as a museum educator.
Hi, I'm Emma Rose Rainville. I currently work at the Esplanade Association, a parks organization in Boston, as a arts administrator. I'm an arts administrator and fundraiser, and previously worked at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston for 6 years, where I was part of the organizing committee and then the bargaining committee for our first contract, which we signed in 2022.
Hey, I'm Jessie Jones. I currently work at the Academy Film Archive. I've been a film archivist in that field for about 20 years. I was on the bargaining committee and the organizing committee for the Academy Foundations Union. We're AFSCME Local 126.
So I guess just to give some background info on all of this, can you give some background into museums moving forward and how this zine kind of came about?
About 2.5 years ago or so, I got an email from Liz Levine, who's head of programs at Museums Moving Forward, and she and I had connected through the museum organizing world. She had come out of working for AFSCME and worked at a museum before that in California, and she sent me an email one day and was like, do you know anyone who's doing anything like a timeline about museum unions? And I had just started trying to compile one myself for my dissertation research. I just finished my PhD at Ohio State writing about the museum labor movement, and was sort of stumbling along with Google Sheets. And we eventually decided to join forces, and we created the Art Museum Unions Index, which tracks all of the art museum unions that exist in private, nonprofit art museums, all the unions that are in those kinds of museums. We had to limit it to make it somewhat manageable of a data set, so we don't have info on children's museums or history museums, science centers, even though those have all been part of this larger movement. And out of that, Museums Moving Forward is a limited life nonprofit that is looking to use data and information about the sector to make it more equitable by 2030. And so they have these data studies that go across the museum field, HR, leadership, workers, every 2 years. And then they have programming around that. So the Art Museum Index was a sort of side project for them. And then out of that and out of the data studies grew this initiative that Liz piloted called the study groups. And so they commissioned 3 study groups for the first year. And I was invited to facilitate one of them on this question of equity, because as Liz and I were working on the index, we kept having these questions about, okay, well, what are some of the things that these new unions are winning in their contracts and museum workers are having as protections on the job for the very first time? How are they building in equity into these contracts? There's a lot of verbal rhetoric around that in the campaigns. What does that look like when it comes down to the contracts? But it didn't really fit in the index. And so then we put out a call and invited people to apply to join this study group. And then we would work together in a sort of horizontal way to produce this zine.
I can start with my perspective on it. So we, as a study group of, I think it ended up being 6 of us, started meeting semi-regularly and kind of all talking about our experience with organizing, especially, and kind of thinking about this question of equity. And for me, a lot of the questions kind of kept circling back around, like, what tools do we wish we had when we were organizing? Or what were the stumbling blocks around communications to talk to people as we were, many of us, on the front lines of organizing, reaching out to new people, trying to get people to understand what the union drive was about, and thinking about creating a communications piece that could be used to help educate people about what unions are doing, even if they're not part of a union, even if they're management, even if they're, on, at a place that has had a union for years, and thinking about both what has been achieved. So building on all of Amanda's wonderful research about all these museum unions and what they've gotten into their contracts, but then also trying to think creatively about what else can we get? What are other models from other industries that have unions, or what are places where we could still push? So those were kind of the motivations.
And I would also just add that we started working on this well over a year ago under very different political and cultural circumstances. And, what I've been noticing, and I'm sure a lot of folks are noticing happening in nonprofit spaces, is this kind of withdrawal from DEIA initiatives. And what we were really kind of trying to look at in the research was the ways in which these contracts have been able to actually kind of protect those initiatives so that they can't be rolled back, because, a contract is a legal document that has to be followed. So I think in the current political climate, it was really important for us to kind of think about the ways in which unions can actually make sure that these things don't go away under outside political pressure.
I just reread a little bit of the zine, and that was the part that stuck out to me again, was that despite all of the DEI pushback that we have explicitly, we talk about that explicitly or implicit DEI, we have that in the contracts. Just raising wages is from the very bottom. We see some of those wages that are over the course of the contract, they're raised by 30% in 2 years. That's imagine someone making $14 an hour, and then all of a sudden you're making 17. That's ridiculous, but that's a huge number. And so being able to combat the larger political administration with our tiny little union contracts has just been it's a salve a little bit at this time.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. So we've touched on this a little bit, but can you give a very brief overview of the state of the museum and nonprofit field?
You have 30 seconds.
Even if that's just bad.
You guys, this zine is 30 pages long. We're not brief people.
We're not brief people. Yeah. I would say, just in general, nonprofits have long coasted on this idea of prestige being compensation and passion for your work, and the fact that you're doing something that's for the common good as something that's worthwhile, and means that to even talk about money is gauche and sort of counterproductive to the mission. If you are so, ridiculous to think of something like salary and how that could be impacted in your life. And then COVID happened, and then the current administration's war on everything has happened, right? So all of these situations that have been sort of, about to combusted, and combined with student debt, combined with precarity, neoliberalization, financialization, all of these things. So it's like a lot of other sectors, just at a point where these careers are not sustainable anymore. And they have only really ever been sustainable for people who have other sources of income, whether that's inherited wealth or a spouse or someone else who can help pay the bills. And even that isn't really working for most people anymore in these fields. And so, I would say that those are some of the things that we're going into, the sort of union movement, why people started to organize, and also this sort of juxtaposition that museums have, where there's extreme wealth inequality within the institutions, from the director level to front of house, the board members to the people who are making everything happen. And the sort of glaring imbalances in society are so clear within a museum workplace most of the time.
Just quickly to add that I think there were also some really interesting catalyzing moments, including the Art Museum Transparency Salary. I probably got that title wrong. There was the power of Google Sheets again. There was a Google Sheet where you could anonymously submit what your salary was and what museum you worked at, and thousands of people across the country submitted. And this was in 2019, I believe. And so for the first time in most of our museum lives, we could compare our salaries with both our coworkers and people across the country. And just that amount of that power change, that power shift was really incredible. And now more immediately in the moment of late 2025, I think it's really telling that the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the largest museum in the country, the art museum that all other museums aim to be, is the bellwether of our industry. They just filed for a wall-to-wall union, which was long gestating, from what I understand, probably 5+ years. And so that says a lot, that even the cream of the crop, the Harvard of art museums, is wanting to unionize.
I would second that, just in highlighting the Art Museum salary transparency spreadsheet as a huge catalyst. I was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art at the time, and I remember that coming across my desk the morning it was published, and I was scandalized by it because I was always taught we're not supposed to talk about money, that, and to echo what Amanda said, that we do this work as a kind of service. And there's some prestige associated with it. But of course, you can't go home and eat prestige for dinner. But when that came across my desk, I remember being actually scared. I was can I get in trouble for sharing that information? And, after talking to some colleagues, an hour later, I put in my information and I felt a lot of relief about it. But it was really incredible in the way that it opened up conversations that people weren't having previously. And, it revealed within my own institution, there was a colleague of mine who was in my department, had been there longer than me, had more museum experience than me, who was making about $7,000 less than me a year. And the only way we could figure out why that was happening was that she's a woman and I'm a man. And so we were able to advocate for each other by sharing that information and create some equity there. And that was before we even started unionizing. So there's power in that transparency. And so I think we really wanted to highlight also how union contracts can create more transparency so that workers can advocate for themselves. And I would echo also what Emma Rose shared about the Met, because really, really incredible what they've done. And they've been working on this for years. I remember having conversations with folks at the Met 6 years ago. So it takes a lot of work to do this, to organize and finally, get a campaign going. But bravo to them.
Yeah.
And then to get a contract.
Yes. That's maybe the hardest part, actually.
And to get management to follow the contract that they've signed. I know, at least from my previous museum job, that I ended up getting blacklisted at for trying to organize there. But I was given a 3% raise and explicitly told to not discuss that with anyone else on staff because I was the only one getting a raise that year.
I've gotten that talk too. Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And
I had a supervisor who used to pass us a little piece of paper with a number on it, a folded piece of paper, every year when we met for our cost of living increases. And before I had a contract, my cost of living increases at the art museum at the PMA were never more than 1.5%. But she would pass us this little secret piece of paper and say, "Don't talk about it." And that was that,
I know we can probably sit here and share horror stories for another 45 minutes, but
Right.
so I did, without getting too far into what's in the zine itself, in the interest of time, I did want to go a little bit deeper into kind of pay equity and the how that fits or how that plays out in the museum field, because I think a lot of people tend to assume that one, museum workers are well paid because it seems like this very professionalized job that you need a lot of degrees for, which is not always reflective of the actual situation on the ground there. So if you can touch on kind of what pay equity looks like across the museum field before this most recent unionization wave, and then the information or the data that you uncovered on how this unionization wave has changed that, at least within the limited scope of your research.
It goes back to what we were all just talking about, transparency and knowledge being power. And through this process and through my union activities, that is the most crystal clear thing. And a lot of art museum staff, employees are part-time, and more are part-time because we don't have to pay them as much. And so in bargaining with my contract, a big thing that we feel like it was a win was to get part-time workers who are doing the same jobs as full-time workers, get them paid the same hourly rate. And part of that was to go to these workers and say, this is how much are you making? Okay, this is how much we're all making. And people just started getting more and more angry. They were agitated. And so it goes back to the thing. It's like no one was talking about it. No one was talking about how much they made because they thought they could get in trouble, and they could have gotten in trouble. And then we could go into just cause. And so at will. And so they could fire you for whatever they wanted to, but they can't now. But that's just kind of a little bit of it. And like I was saying earlier, we had people making, in my workplace, the academy, we had frontline people making, I think, $18 an hour. And in order to get the salaries up a little bit, we had to tell them this, and it felt like a bizarre thing, but it was like, we are a specialized place. You very rarely hire people that don't have master's degrees. You don't require it, but it's not, but it is preferred. And there are people who work at non-specialized jobs in the state of California for $20 an hour minimum. And so we brought that to them. And again, this knowledge is power, everyone working together, the labor movement in fast food companies and the labor movement in broader areas coming together like that. We stepped up from off of the shoulders of fast food workers in order to get our specialized people a little bit more money. And it's just, again, the power of community and the power of organization.
I think there also is a way that the sector uses as a shield, kind of, that this is a systemic issue, that this is something that, these are coveted jobs that many people want. And so they use that kind of as a cudgel against their staff. But there's a way that it was very obviously weakening the organizations. An example from my time at the MFA in Boston, my role there was as a grant writer. And one of the things that I managed was a foundation relationship where we applied for a conservation fellow. And the foundation asked us, don't you want to raise the salary you're applying for this term? Because you haven't raised it the last 2 times that you've applied for this fellowship. And I thought, oh my gosh, wonderful. So I go to the head of conservation who, manages the hiring of this fellow. And I say, guess what? They're willing for us to raise the fellow's salary. And they tell me that they can't, because then the fellow would be making more than their supervisor. And that was then a terrible thing to have to communicate to the foundation. And of course, I didn't communicate that, but I said, thank you so much for that offer. We'll be applying for the same amount, which I'm sure confused them. But that compounding of, if your supervisor doesn't make that much, then you can't make that much. Then it was really something that was especially evident in our conservation department, which was where our union drive started. And it also meant that we did have positions that would be open and that would cycle through, and our collection suffered for it and our exhibition suffered for it. And it does become something where it actually affects the operations of your museum. And that power of, a union coming out and calling out something that was actually harming the museum's operation, I think is maybe not acknowledged as much as it hopefully would, should be. And I'd love maybe if MMF or somewhere else can have some sort of study of a longitudinal study of retention of museums with unions. I know they've got a lot of great questions that they ask you about, unionized staff versus non-unionized staff, but I do think that sustainability of how much you're making can be a real make or break for your time at a museum.
Turnover is always just so high in my experience working in museums, whether it's people leaving the field just completely, or having to make a lateral move to a different institution to get the increase that they deserve, and turnover is really expensive for institutions. It costs money when you have to bring on a new person or fill a role that's been vacant. And sometimes those roles remain vacant. And there's a lot of job creep that happens, which is really damaging to the staff that remains there. So, I think MMF did some really interesting research in when they were surveying folks in the field about like how many people who work in museums now are currently considering leaving, right, the field completely. And Amanda, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but
I think it's like at least half. Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so that's an issue that I think these institutions need to grapple with in order to continue existing. And I do believe that a union contract actually does address not all of those issues, but it can certainly improve some of those problems in our workplaces. I think we all recognize that a union contract is not going to fix everything. And no contract is perfect, and it's only as good as the people who are enforcing it, who are in the union. But I think what we found is there's a lot of really interesting ways that a contract can improve some of these conditions.
Yeah, and one more thing I want to say about pay is just thinking about those, like in first contracts, especially, there are always compromises in contracts, right? That a contract is a compromise, but especially the first time, because you're just trying to sort of solidify a base upon which to keep growing. But again and again, in the interviews I was doing for my dissertation research, people said the priority was always raising the minimum. And so there were a lot of places where, there would be people saying like, I haven't had a raise in 5 years. I need a raise. And the bargaining team would say, well, actually, you're one of the highest paid people in our unit, and it's not your turn right now. And almost all of the stories I heard were people saying, okay, then we wait. And I want to shout out my former colleagues at Mass MoCA who went on strike in 2024 for 3 weeks around pay, and they were trying to raise the minimum wage. And eventually the union, Local 2110, they were like, the difference between our proposal and what management is stuck on is $150,000. And so some board member was like, okay, can I just like give this to them and we can give it to them, everyone, as a bonus? And so the museum proposed that as an option and said, if we divide this up and everyone gets a bonus, then you're happy, right? And there were a lot of conversations within the unit and within the bargaining team of saying, no, that first of all, bonuses get taxed. So you don't actually get to take as much of that home as you think you do. And it's not just about 150 grand that you disperse. It's about how do we make these entry-level jobs, these front of house jobs, sustainable when Dunkin' Donuts pays more money down the road. And these are the jobs that we have research from many different institutions that front of house roles are the most diverse racially, in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, and these are the most precarious, the most, they were first laid off during the pandemic. And this is a field that's trying to diversify and or at least says they are, right? And we need to help invest in these positions and do that with wage growth. And so it's been really encouraging to see the way that rank and file workers in these unions are doing that and are saying, okay, well, some people are going to have to take a sacrifice and wait for the next contract or the one after that so that we can get everybody at the base a little bit closer to a living wage, even if it's not quite there yet.
And I think, Amanda, just to add on to that, I think it's absolutely true that a rising tide lifts all ships. And this happened at the art museum. We won, it's been a while now, but I believe 17% increases over the course of a 3-year contract. And management or senior management, the executive team, decided to give those same increases to everyone at the museum. So even management who were not in the unit. Partially, I think, to offset that problem that Emma Rose highlighted, where if those increases went into effect, there would be some supervisors who weren't in the unit who would be making less than the people that they were supervising. Again, they promised these increases and also all of the benefits that we won to everyone at the institution in the name of equity, I think. Of course, there was no contract there forcing them to follow through on that, like we had for our members. But I think it's true that even folks in middle management and senior management, to be honest, benefited from the things that we won in our contract.
I always think back to one other conversation I had, again, at my previous employer. They were constantly complaining that we couldn't keep front desk staff. And then when I brought up that we're paying them $9 an hour, they said that it's only a part-time job, so it doesn't really matter. And then wondering why we kept getting college freshmen who were incredibly flaky and never showed up for a shift.
So. And it's not, it's not only students. I mean, students need a living wage too, but it's a lot of artists have these jobs, right? They work part-time visitor services, part-time art handling, all of these things because they want the flexibility to have the rest of the time for their art. And that should be an asset for an art museum, you would think.
Yeah.
And also, coming out of COVID, those frontline staffers were the ones who were put in these really, truthfully dangerous positions, having to come back to work while, me as a museum educator, I was happily working from home. So those are some of the most important jobs actually at museums, and some of the most, people-centered jobs. Those are the folks who are creating an experience for the visitors who come there. So I think their work needs to be valued as much as any conservator or curator for keeping these institutions running. And one way that the art museum tried to kind of bust our union was by kind of trying to make that distinction between professional and non-professional workers. And Luckily, we were able to argue against that and get a wall-to-wall union at the PMA. But that was so important to us when we were organizing and campaigning, that like every single department be recognized in this contract together, because you're a lot stronger together than you are if you're separated into these like professional and non-professional groupings.
And it's really hard to have a nice museum experience if the trash cans are overflowing. So,
Yeah.
So I wanted to touch also, because obviously 2025 has not been the best year for DEI initiatives, or any really any kind of diversity programming in the United States. So even outside of pay equity, I wanted to take a look at what you uncovered in terms of DEI, either as you laid out in the zine, implicit or explicit wording in the contracts. And if you're seeing any shifts since you published the zine, if you've seen any shifts in terms of unions pushing for a greater say in exhibitry and programming with all of the crackdowns that are coming down from the federal side right now. Sorry, I know that was a lot of topics all at once.
Was there a question in there, Gabe?
Somewhere. Yeah, so if we can start with kind of DAI in the contracts themselves. And for those not familiar with museum lingo, diversity, equality, or diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion.
And every museum will have its own version of that acronym.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So we, as we said in the zine, we wanted to highlight not just things that explicitly address those things, maybe use those words in the contract language, but also things that implicitly, like pay equity, can contribute to a more diverse and more equitable workforce. But some of them, like explicit things, like I think especially coming out of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter uprisings, some of the contracts that were negotiated in 2021, 2022, some of them will have an explicit clause dedicated to DEAI and protecting that and saying this museum needs to have a DEAI committee and it needs to have 1 to X number of people who are from the bargaining unit represented on it. So it can't just be a management only committee. That work gets paid and is, a normal part is maybe part of labor management committees, maybe it's its own thing. It's sort of dependent workplace to workplace. That was one aspect. One of the ones I found really interesting was bilingual pay. And I know a lot of, especially Spanish-speaking staff members will have to do sort of, we're trying to be inclusive. We want to translate this into Spanish. Can you do this for me? And that work is unpaid often, but a few contracts have gotten provisions to have that kind of work paid. If you're translating into Spanish, if you're translating a tour into ASL, those kinds of extra labors get compensated.
Yeah, one of the things that I know we got in our contract at the MFA was that senior leadership had promised us that they would do quarterly reporting on the diversity of staff. So, and they would do it by department, because there was also this issue of, they'd use these statistics of like X percentage of MFA Boston staff identifies people of color, but almost all those staff would be in facilities and security and visitor services. And so that would kind of make it have a false sense of how diverse our staff was. And this was pre-unionizing that we wanted this to be more transparent, at least internally. This wasn't something we were putting on the MFA website. And, they did it once and then they wouldn't publish it again. And so we got it in our contract that they would, I think we only got it that they would do it once a year, but still that was an improvement, that once a year we would get a broken down by department what the demographics and ethnicities of all departments were. And that was a big win, because you kind of, you can't say you care about something that you're not tracking and counting. And for us to I mean, again, from a fundraising point of view and like working with foundations, that was something I was regularly asked to provide externally, and was pretty galling when I wasn't able to provide it, because we were such a large leading museum. I think another place that we thought about equity in the more implicit side was, which was one of the pieces that I worked on in the zine, was around benefits. And I happened to go through a maternity leave while organizing and on the bargaining committee. And it was really interesting to me to research into the ways that the different contracts approached benefits for parental leave, and around the changing language, and around how explicit whether or not they included it, whether or not it was something they just said, oh, it's whatever is in our handbook, which of course, for all of us in unionizing, let's alarm bells go off. But a lot of contracts did get it explicitly in their, into their contract about what the parental leave benefits would be, and benefits around, more than just their federally mandated lactation breaks and things like that. And it was really wonderful to see, because that also is a really challenging experience to go through as a working person, no matter what industry you work in, but in a competitive industry that isn't always well paid for people who are all of a sudden taking on a huge financial burden. It can be even more stressful. So hoping there can be even more advances in that area too.
Yeah, and I would say, in our section, which of the zine that explicitly talks about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, if you look at the numbers, the percentages, not everyone was able. I'd say most contracts were unable to win clauses in at least their first contract having to do with a museum having a DEIA committee or having DEIA training for workers. So those numbers could be a lot higher. But we were also looking at what, not only what has been achieved, but what can be achieved. So, we looked at other contracts in other areas of work, teachers unions. And we found provisions that, protected freedom of expression for educators, free menstrual products for in spaces at work, all those other things that we hope, I think, as a group of people who worked on this, that museums, museum unions will be able to win in the future. So we were really kind of trying to take a specific look at art museums, but also in thinking about the future and future contracts and successor contracts, what else can possibly be achieved around these issues.
To your point about what's been happening since then, I mean, we have the contracts that we looked at that were the ones publicly available to us at that time. But since then, there's a spreadsheet, again, a spreadsheet that gets linked to through a QR code. And I've updated that here and there with some more contracts as they've gone public. And I've expanded beyond the sort of MMF private nonprofit art museum limitation, because I think it's just helpful to have that information as much as easily accessible as possible. And I have seen the university art museums might have a provision, I think it's the University of Michigan Art Museum has a provision around academic freedom in their recent contract. The Tacoma Art Museum has really fantastic language about how to support transitioning colleagues, and sort of a language guide. Here's what HR should be doing. Here's what the supervisor should be doing. And I just, in all of the federal attacks on trans rights, and these rights are going away on federal level, maybe state level, depending on where you live, to have that baked into your workplace protection, at least, right? That's a sphere where we can actually move something and have some control over what rights and what protections exist for one another. So there's still, I would say, mostly exceptions rather than the rule, but hopefully through projects like the zine and this ongoing living database can help inspire people who are now at the bargaining table for their second contract, or who are just starting their campaign, or like the Met, who will win their election next month and begin bargaining and things like that.
So the next thing I want to touch on was kind of go back to transparency. But I also wanted to take a moment to explain to our listeners how museums are structured, because I think that's another thing that is, if you're not familiar with the nonprofit world, understanding the Byzantine internal structures of museum politics can definitely be very confusing. So if you can touch a little bit on like how most major art museums are set up and who makes up their boards. Usually, obviously there's variation, but if you can, and then leading into why they're often so unwilling to share any of that information or share that information publicly.
Not like nonprofits, most museums are 501c3s, so they get tax benefits like other nonprofits. People who donate their money to museums can write that off on their taxes. Actually, I believe museums helped write that tax code to support their operations back in the day, and so they have to have a board. And most board members are, boards what have the different obligations. The obligations, fiduciary obligation. I'm forgetting. There are 3. Does anyone else remember the other ones? But basically, they're supposed to safeguard the health of an institution, and usually they translate that to mean financial sustainability. And in practice, what that means is most board members are very wealthy because they're expected to give a lot of money to the institution every year, and they get some benefits back, whether it's in the case of Warren Kander's a high-profile board member at the Whitney Museum with his ties to weapons industry and sort of the violence at the U.S.-Mexico border. You get a bit of reputation laundering if you serve on a board, because you get to say, "Oh no, but I do all this bad stuff for profit, but then I give back to the community." And then also there's some really interesting insider trading that kind of happens with the art market, especially in contemporary art museums or collecting institutions, where and there's a fantastic scholar named Nizan Chaket who writes about this, but basically, if you're on a board, you get to say, "Oh, I think maybe curator, you should collect some of these people," and the curator is dependent on the board giving. So then maybe they have an exhibition of this artist and the board member buys some, and then it inflates the value of their collection to have the work on view in a museum. And so it really, in any other sector, would be insider trading, but it's just how the art market works. And so there are calls to sort of reform taxes and things around that. But right now it's just a way, like people in the academic world call it philanthrocapitalism, right? How philanthropy helps perpetuate need and inequality through these systems, which is not to say that museum boards don't have excellent, well-meaning people on them who really believe in things, but often there's just no connection. The barriers between staff and the board are really set in stone. I remember talking to a board member who is the in charge of the education committee. I worked as an educator like Adam, and at one point I mentioned something about like what my salary was, and he was shocked. He had no idea, because he gets a big, this is how much the museum spends on salaries, but he didn't know that at the time I was making $33,000 a year. And was just an unfathomable number to someone in his world and his kind of circle. And I just think that kind of, there are a lot of opportunities that get missed in terms of how boards work. And I'll stop. I can go on for a really long time, but I'll stop there.
I think there's also one of the things that you didn't touch on, Amanda, is that very complex dynamic that obviously the director of the museum reports to the board, but the board is essentially selected by the director. Like, the director is kind of has tacit approval of whether or not somebody even gets nominated to be on the board. There's obviously a governance committee on all of these things, but there's a way in which the director shapes the board feeds back to the director, and that can be a really complex dynamic, and it can not always be successful, and staff can get caught in the middle of that dynamic in a way. I mean, we just saw an example with the Philadelphia Art Museum of this board versus director clash that clearly was not working. But it can also be something where the board is only hearing what the director necessarily is telling them and what the senior management is telling them, but they have this huge influence on what the museum does. And that disconnect can feel really wild. There was a kind of infamous moment at the MFA where we had the board chair come to speak to the all staff, which was this kind of big thing that didn't happen very often. And he mentioned that he was wearing $80 socks as part of what he was talking about. And it was a throwaway comment for him. He thought nothing of it. And it to all of us sitting in there in that hall, 400 of us, was galling in a way of just realizing, like, yep, that's who our board is. And that kind of was I give that as an example of an emblematic way of, like, the way that you have a disconnect with the board. We were getting time with the board chair, but that's what he was telling us about.
It could be worse. It could be the Starbucks CEO just casually dropping a Holocaust reference in front of all.
Oh, absolutely.
We had, I mean, at the art museum under the previous director, and I wasn't even going to bring up the whole Philadelphia Museum of Art director board fiasco that's going on now.
That's another episode.
Yeah, but with the previous director too, like, there was literally, like, no access to the board whatsoever. We, in our first contract, when we were negotiating, we made multiple proposals to, the legal team from Morgan Lewis, who was representing the museum, and to the legal counsel at the museum, they were like the lead negotiators. We never once saw the director at least for our first contract in those negotiating sessions. But we had made a number of requests to, like, maybe we could have one union member, go to one board meeting a year and report out, like, on what's going on from, like, the union's perspective. Soundly rejected. We finally got to the point where we were proposing, like, can we do a written report and just send it to the board? And they absolutely rejected it. They told us with absolute clarity that we would not have any access to the board, and the board had no interest in hearing from us.
Wow.
And I don't know if that was, just specific to the culture of the art museum at the time. I suspect it's pretty endemic to the field, because we were looking at some of these proposals in our transparency section of the zine to try and see, like, if there are any contracts where there was kind of a set language about, like, access to the board, because ultimately the board is, I think, they're the ones who have the most power over the institution. And there were a couple of contracts. I mean, MoMA is one of them in New York, but that's one of the oldest contracts in our kind of field, where there was some language around access to the board, and if any major changes were going to be, like, instituted by the board of trustees, that union members had to be informed, and that's great. But for the most part, there were, like, no contracts where we had where we found any kind of, like, language specifying board transparency, which is shocking, but also in some ways not surprising, given, like, the culture or just the way these institutions are built. They rely on the board, like Amanda said, for so many things. And
more so now, right? Because the federal grants are gone or insecure, or
The board question, from my place that I work has been so fascinating because I work for the Academy of Motion Pictures. Half or more than that of the board are union members. And so, I believe we floated the question during bargaining, and it was much like Adam said, it was just like, it's like it wasn't even asked. They're just like, no. And we took that with like, okay, this is not the hill we're going to climb up right now. But even with that, with union members on the board, all kinds of different trade members, a board is a board, and they're secret, and they don't like us coming in and hanging out.
But we also did want to highlight that there are certain tools at, unions, members, just the general public's disposal in order to get some information about not only, museum boards, but also, museum leadership just through like publicly available tax documents, and we wanted to make sure that that information was out there for folks too. Like, you can get a 990 for your institution and see just how much the top 10 people are being paid. You can see what the museum is spending on their 5 largest contracts to outside groups. Like, there's information out there that can be really useful, even if it's not through a contract. I would love it if it was all in a contract, like you have to give us this information. But I think just some of that is not going to be winnable.
Reading 990s is always a very interesting way to spend an afternoon.
But not always the most gripping reading, like contracts. So part of the goal is like, okay, this is really a chore. Can we help busy, stressed out people by summarizing some of it for you?
So I think in the interest of everyone's time, I wanted to, I've been dominating the question scene here. I wanted to open the floor to Sam if you have anything that's popped up during this conversation.
Thanks a lot for enlightening me and the listeners. I just want to bring up something that Adam said, like right in the beginning, the rising tides lifts all ships. And you brought up the fast food workers, you brought up, Dunkin' Donuts. And it's not that you're not looking down on them and saying, no, they shouldn't have this, we should have this. You're saying they should have this and we should have this and we all should have more, which is absolutely, I love, because that's about community. It's about solidarity. That's why we're doing what we're doing. And so I just want to thank you for that. And thanks for coming on, because I could listen to you talk and BS about all this for hours. I'm sure Gabe could as well.
I've been having to hold my tongue a lot. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we could hang up the recording and then you could give us all the gossip about where you used to work.
That might happen. With the research that you've done, and obviously some like major shifts in the museum field after or as you were writing the zine and since it came out, where do you all see museum, or where do you see this unionization wave going in the future? Where do you want it to go? What do you see as the future of museum unionization?
You have 30 minutes.
I can start with a quick, I left the museum, the MFA shortly after we signed our first contract. And it's been really gratifying to stay in touch with my colleagues there, and they just signed their second contract and got even more wins than they had. They built on the first one just as we had hoped. And it's been really wonderful to hear about the positives that have come out, the learnings that they figured out from the first one. But, I also think there's real ways that a union creates a community of care. Unionization is a supreme act of care for your community. All of us who are involved in unionizing, if we just didn't like the place, we'd leave. We invested so much time in making this place better, not just for us. In fact, often not for us specifically. Many of us have left the place that we unionized, but for the generations coming after us. And I'm really proud that the MFA right now is making strides in things like what they recently gave back the two David Drake pots to the descendants of David Drake, which is a landmark decision in the treatment of art by enslaved African Americans. And I see that as, part of this evidence of a community of care, of that came from an exhibition that was, and that came from all the people in that exhibition creating real, genuine connection with these descendants. And I don't see those as unrelated. I don't know if the museum leadership would agree with me, but I do. I think that that's real evidence of the way that this can shift the culture of a museum in just 3 years.
I'm really happy you said that because I couldn't agree more. Even just in the years that we were organizing and then bargaining and through even working under the contract, there were many disruptions in the field. Like we went through a huge moment of layoffs and furloughs during COVID, and we didn't even have a contract yet at that point. But we rallied together as a community who worked together to support those people who were really suffering, who had lost their jobs, who needed help with groceries, who needed help with paying rent, and we came together and did that even outside of like the formal union. So I think that's absolutely true. I think one thing that I learned also is that, and this was true of my personal experience, is just that like through organizing, I think it creates, like, if you're involved in your workplace, that oftentimes leads to greater civic engagement too in your communities, in local politics. That was my experience 100%. And I know it's true for a lot of my colleagues as well. So I think, I was talking to someone recently who told me, shared with me information that like higher density, like union countries have higher voting rates, like it's pretty incredible to think about it when you think about it that way.
Say, let's get some of these museum organizers into some local city councils.
There we go.
Yeah. I see it in Los Angeles. Like, I'm so proud of my city right now because the Natural History Museum, 300 people, their own unit, their own local. LACMA just now, like 2 months ago, their own local. These are huge, huge institutions, and it means so much for the region. And what happens in a big city, kind of people see that and say, "Oh, I can do it too." And even in my own workplace, like we see it. And I work with a lot of people that have been working in the same place, same jobs for decades. We had someone, he's not a union member, but he just celebrated 40 years with the Academy. Wow. Like, this is we stick around for a reason, for many reasons. And one thing I've seen is that we're all feeling more powerful with our union. And I still have, as a steward, I still have people who come to me and are afraid to rock the boat. And they don't want to upset anything. And I tell them that it's actually our boat. They're rocking it. The contract is what they're breaking, and it's our boat. So again, with the ships thing, I don't know what it is, and people respond to that when I flip the power on them. It's like, actually, we have this power. They're rocking our boat. They agreed to this contract. And so the more and more that people see the power that we have, the more empowered they feel. And it just, especially in LA, and I know the Met and everything, is just, there's a good feeling right now that we all feel our worth, even though it's not for profit. Like, we can't necessarily be tied back to how many brake pads we're making or whatever, but these museums are open and people come because of the people on the ground.
I would echo what everyone has said. I think I was just talking to another researcher today trying to figure out like what percentage of museums now have unions. And that's a really kind of impossible number to pin down because of, I mean, private, public, university, art, non-museum, all these different things. But I came to like maybe 7 to 10%, maybe. And that's not very much, right? And so there's a lot of room for this movement to keep growing. And through the index, we've tracked that, yes, this wave started in 2019, but it's been growing stronger almost every year. There was 1 year of a dip, but since then, more unions every year. So I would like to see a field where a union job is the norm, not the exception, where people are engaged in their unions and not taking it for granted and not sort of just having this service mentality with the union, but are really militant about winning things for their colleagues, getting out into their communities, where the museums can team up with the unions and use some of that power. Like we just saw AFSCME join in a lawsuit with the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the American Alliance of Museums to help protest the cuts to the IMLS. And, the American Alliance of Museums is really proud of themselves for having successfully won that lawsuit. But AFSCME was absolutely critical to that fight and would not have probably joined in had not all of these museum workers just unionized with AFSCME in the past few years. So how can we also see this labor power to shift some of the dynamics around the nonprofit funding system? How can we have a sort of lobbying agency through this worker power to help shift the priorities in federal budgets and things like that? And I think that museums are spaces that tell stories, and they're very trusted for that. There are a lot of studies, again, through AAM that say museums are one of the most trusted sources of information out there, more so than schools and the government and the media. And it can be a very problematic thing, but also because we have that trust, we can shift some stories around what a union is. A lot of people in this country don't know or have sort of inherited Cold War ideas about unions, right? Or they're just for coal miners. They don't exist for the service economy and the knowledge sector. But I think museums are high profile. They're right in the middle of cities often. They get a lot of press when workers go on strike. And I think that can help shift these ideas. And as museum workers democratize who is telling those stories, that can only get better. And for museums and for the larger project of democracy overall, right? That we are changing the way these stories get told, and that can do a lot for the labor movement and for people in general.
This might be me wish casting a little bit too hard, but in cities like Philly, where we have AFSCME DC 47 that has, I think you're now at 7 organizations across the city, and other cities like LA, New York, and Boston that have had a major wave in the past couple of years, has there been any whispering of looking towards sectoral bargaining within at least a region, or is that still a little too far in the future?
I've heard people wondering about it. Yeah, I mean, people have talked about, because a lot of people, like part-time educators are contractors, part-time art handlers are contractors. So there's definitely a need, I think, for the kind of SAG-AFTRA model in museums. I'm also really personally inspired by the Higher Education Labor United folks, which they talked about a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast union. That's just a coalition of unions and workers from dining halls to professors to adjuncts to grad students. And so more collaboration, even just between like UAW and AFSCME, sharing this kind of information, like around contracts, would be ideal. But yeah, if anyone's listening and wants to get in touch about that, hit me up.
Well, I don't have any other questions, so I want to echo Sam and say thank you all for coming to talk with us. And if you want to give a plug for the zine, where folks can find it, where folks can find all of you if you want to be found.
You can download the zine from Museums Moving Forward's website. And if you just Google that, that'll pop up. Go to study groups and you'll see the Museums and Equity study group. That's probably the most direct way to do it. But we've also been all sharing it on our social medias. I'm on Instagram, Amanda Tobin Ripley.
Not for me, but I'd say yes, follow Amanda. Amanda's always like pushing out really great stuff, both her own work and others in the field. So I highly recommend that.
I'm a big museum union nerd.
Well, thank you all for taking the time to talk with us. This has been a pleasure.
It has been more than a pleasure. Thank you so much. Sorry to bring up so much PTSD, but
Likewise.